Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Joel Hunter here to discuss with you in our Introduction to Ethics course the very popular and probably the best known theory outside of philosophical circles is consequentialism, or as it's more narrowly called sometimes, utilitarianism. We're going to talk about consequentialism and what it is and its attractions. What are some of the benefits of this ethical theory? And that will be covered in today's video. And then in our follow-up video to this one, we'll look at the next chapter in the Russ Schaeffer-Landau text, which is looking at some of the drawbacks to consequentialism. So let's get right to it and start with the definition, of consequentialism. And we can just look at this together. It's as, if you have the third edition, it's at the bottom of page 119. If you have fourth edition, it's about the same page, if not the same page. And the definition is, acts are morally right just because they maximize the amount of goodness in the world. I'll pause for a second and just note that prepositional phrase there at the end, in the world. So it is important to look at the results of an action as widely as possible. So it is never just limited to an individual or even a group or even a larger society of people. It is instead measured against the goodness or misery in the world that is created as a result of the act, or results from the act. So that also can go through time as well, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so another way of putting this maximizing the amount of goodness in the world is we call such actions optimific. Okay, I need you to know this term, and it occurs here at the very beginning of the chapter, and it is the act that yields the greatest balance of benefits over drawbacks. It's a very strange word. I mean, it comes, obviously you can see its near relatives are optimal, which would be basically a synonym for best. And so it's a way of saying the best action is the one, again, that yields the greatest balance of benefits over drawbacks. Okay, and when you're looking at greatest balance, again, you have to think of the scope of that measurement, if we can call it that. You have to look at more than just the balance of benefits or drawbacks for an individual person, but you have to look across the world and see what those effects would be. Consequentialism is not easy. Okay, so let's look at how you actually apply this theory to any given action. All right, so the first thing to do is to identify what is intrinsically good, and we're going to talk about the most common form of consequentialism shortly, but there are lots of candidates for what is valuable in and of itself. You know, we've talked about that when we were discussing value theory, and so there are the candidates like happiness, hedonism. There's the candidate of autonomy. There's a candidate knowledge, there's virtue. Any of these, and there are others, that could count as what is intrinsically valuable. You could have something like even environmental health or world peace, etc. Then you also need to identify what is intrinsically bad. Remember, we're looking at the balance of benefits over drawbacks, and so we have to know both the good and the bad results. And so the bad results, you know, what is intrinsically bad in and of itself would be things like physical pain, mental anguish, sadistic impulses, betrayal of innocent persons, things like that that are always bad and never to be morally discounted. Okay, so then once you've identified what's intrinsically good and what's intrinsically bad, and you carry that with you as you make other decisions, Then you determine your options in the given situation, the choice that you need to make. What actions are open to you at the moment? And then for each option, then you have to determine the value of its results. So that's where you bring in the intrinsically good and the intrinsically bad. How much of what is intrinsically good will each action bring about? In other words, remember, you're listing out what your available options are in step 3, okay? And it could be 2, it could be 5, it could be many more. But you list out what each action is, and then what good will each action bring about? And then what bad will each action bring about? And meaning good and bad, intrinsically good or bad, okay? And then pick the action that yields the best balance, the highest ratio of good to bad results. Okay, that's the optimific choice to make. And that's what you want to do. That is, in fact, your moral duty. You ought to do that thing, make that choice, do that action. Doing anything else, falling short, is going to be immoral then. If you fail to achieve the greatest balance of good over bad. Okay? As I said, a very, very daunting ethical theory. Okay, so now let's look at a very common form of consequentialism. It is a family of theories. It will vary depending on what you plug into. Let me come back here for a second. What you put into the categories of intrinsically good and intrinsically bad. So in other words, your value theory supplies some of the information you need in order to use this normative theory. And so basically consequentialism is flexible to take in whichever value you find in whatever theory that you adopt, value theory you adopt. It can take that in. And so each consequentialism will look different depending on what those intrinsic goods and intrinsic bads are. Okay, so let's look at one of those, which is act utilitarianism. Now, what we're going to do is make this, we're going to make the shorthand utilitarianism here on out. But just to be clear why we're calling it act utilitarianism, because we're going to have another form of utilitarianism called rule utilitarianism. We'll talk about that later. But for now, utilitarianism means act utilitarianism. So this is the most common form of consequentialism. And according to utilitarianism, there's one ultimate moral standard, the principle of utility. And so what is that? It says this: an action is morally required just because it does more to improve overall well-being than any other action you could have done in the circumstances. Okay, so well-being is then that intrinsically valuable thing, okay? So faring poorly then is going to be intrinsically bad. Okay, so there you go. Many utilitarians have been hedonists, and that that follows from this principle of utility. I bet you could be a utilitarian and a desire of satisfaction theorist as well. But you don't have to take a stand on that. Just know that your consequentialism will look different depending on those different values. So if you're maximizing the overall well-being in the world, okay, that is what makes acts right. If they maximize the overall amount of well-being in the world, then that's what the utilitarian says about those acts. Okay. So maximizing goodness, have to do some clarifications here. Because there are often misunderstandings about what that means. And part of it comes from the slogan that John Stuart Mill, English philosopher of the 19th century, he summarized the utilitarian view with this claim that the greatest good for the greatest number is what is required of us. Okay, so we have to be careful though, and it's easy to miss something here about that. So we're looking again, if we're a hedonist like Mill, and we are looking to produce the greatest overall balance of happiness over misery. And here's what we got to do. We got to avoid this. So claim one misunderstanding is we must do whatever benefits the greatest number of people. Okay, so no. That is sometimes true, that's the act that needs to be done. However, that's not always true. Just because you have an act that will benefit more people than another act that will benefit fewer does not mean that you pick that first option. That's because that the benefit to the majority may be trivial. In other words, of low quality. Whereas the benefit to the minority, the smaller number of people, may be quite significant and quite large. Okay, so that's why we have to reject misunderstanding number one. Misunderstanding number two says that we must always choose the action that creates the greatest amount of happiness. No. And this is where, again, we would say, if you have two different acts or two different plans, and plan one is going to create more happiness than the second plan, you don't automatically choose the first plan. The reason is that if you implement the first plan, you also have to take into account the misery that is created. And so it may be, that the first plan creates more happiness than the second plan, but maybe it creates more misery too. And so as a result, the net balance is going to be less happiness for plan one than for plan two. And there's an example in there, a great example of the Roman emperor who wanted to please the public, and so he wanted to create more happiness by offering games, with and providing free food and things like that. So you have to look at total happiness versus the total misery, and you have to then figure out what the net balance is between those two. Okay, so that's what we have to look at, and that's why it's not easy to do these computations, but that's actually what is expected. Okay, a couple things to point out here when we're talking about what results are we looking at when we're making this determination of whether the result is happy or sad or misery. Is it the actual results, or is it the expected results? Most utilitarians will claim that the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by its actual results, not its expected results. Okay, and that is important because it's important that some degree of moral ignorance is permitted. We can't know in advance what all of the good and bad effects will be. I mean, think of Lincoln's assassination, for example. Who would have foreseen the overall good that might have come from that, or the overall bad that came from that? Your author also suggests thinking of Jesus' crucifixion as well. So you think about what that obviously that goes in the intrinsically bad category, right? A crucifixion is a gruesome, torturous form of capital punishment. But the result was, for some, it was then the opportunity to promote his message, which had world-changing, and most people would say positive, in positive ways, at least in terms of how it valued the poor and the marginalized, and how it looked to a future that was built on things like peace and love and trust and those kinds of qualities. So anyway, to make the point, it's hard to know what the actual results will be, and so there has to be room for moral ignorance, but you go and even though that may make some utilitarians uncomfortable, you have to go with what you can reasonably expect. And that gets to the problem of it, or not the problem really, but the question of intentions, which is a morally different category for utilitarians than the actions. Utilitarians always will focus on the actions as being what is morally significant. Okay, so expected, if it is not known that a particular action, which on balance in the immediate looks like the right action, or if it's as the optimific action, but that it turns out to have disastrous results, of course that's possible. And we could look back and say, oh, well, you should have done this other plan, or made this other choice instead that would not have had those disastrous results. But that's hindsight, and we don't have that ability to go back and right those wrongs that were made. What we're called to do, or what we're expected, I should say, to do at this point then, is to redress those what those disastrous results were with the next choice that we make. Okay, so here's the point. So in implementing the optimific choice, it can be done, and it is done then, with the best of intentions. You're intending to bring about good results. And so the intention then is measured differently than the actual results. And that's, how am I don't know why I'm struggling so much with trying to get this across, but and part of it is because it's not connected to the moral rightness or wrongness of the action. The intention is not connected to the moral rightness or wrongness of the intention. So actions are going to be right provided they're optimific, as I've been saying. But intentions are morally good provided they're reasonably expected to yield those good results. Okay, so there's that reasonable expectation requirement to measure intentions, but actions and intentions are morally different categories, and they're evaluated differently. I think I said that better. Okay. So yeah, sometimes an action can be expected to turn out badly, but then ends up with surprisingly good results. So these kinds of differences make rightness. Okay, so if utilitarians, let's put it this way, if utilitarians make rightness a matter of expected results, then they have to judge actions that are done expected to turn out badly. They have to judge them as immoral, even if the good results come about as a surprise, right? But that seems to be not something that utilitarians would allow, is because they always measure on the basis of results. Okay, let's move on. All right, some of the attractions of utilitarianism then. First of all, impartiality. Everyone is equal. Everyone is equal moral value. It doesn't matter any of the identity categories, what your sex is, what your race is, what your religion is, what your socioeconomic status is. None of those things matter. Everyone's well-being counts, and counts the same. Okay, and that's at the time that this was formulated in the 19th century, this is a radical idea, this kind of impartiality. Impartiality is not a new idea, but the basis for this moral equivalence of individuals, was, it challenged things like a monarchy, for example, or nobility, the idea of an aristocracy. You can't treat your lessers as morally worse than you treat your moral equals, your status equals, your aristocratic, your nobility. Okay, then there is the advantage of justifying our conventional moral wisdom. Most of our deeply held moral beliefs, utilitarians will say, are correct. So things like, things that we regard as deeply, deeply immoral, and slavery, and rape, and killing, they're wrong, and they tell us, and utilitarians tell us why they're wrong. They're wrong because they produce so much harm and very little good, and if any. So think of the things then that we think are morally right. And I mean here the sort of conventional thinking about what's morally right. Helping the poor, keeping your promises, telling the truth, being brave in the face of danger, things like that. All those kinds of actions are really beneficial. So utilitarianism tends to commend them. Okay, so the same thing would be true of then how utilitarians would assess virtues and vices. It would work, again, along the lines of our conventional thinking there. It would give us then a reason as to why those intuitions or those conventions tend to be right, because they can explain that when you're motivated by vice, then those tends to harm others, say greed or ingratitude or malice, or when your virtues, when you act on those, then benevolence, for example, tends to do good for others. Now, they can be mistaken, of course. Our moral intuitions can be mistaken about this. But at the very least, utilitarianism then earns high marks because it shows how to justify, has an explanation for our deepest moral beliefs. Okay? Next, conflict resolution, and this in particular means moral conflict. When there is moral conflict, this utilitarianism gives us a method for making a difficult moral decision. And this is a very important thing that any ethical theory can do. Okay, so your author goes into a really good example of this in talking about gossip. I'll let you look at that, and in showing where the moral conflict arises. Okay, so if you are focused on what maximizes well-being, then that is what you apply to resolve the conflict. So it may result in a very hard choice if it goes against maybe what you would prefer or what would be easiest. But at least you know what the theory says will help you sort out the consequences of making one choice or the other or another, and how you determine which is the right one to do, which is the one that will maximize well-being. Okay? So like if it's a friend's feelings or something like that you're wanting to protect, it will, and that it involves it involves something like confronting your friend about something, or ignoring it, or how do you, is honesty in the given situation, it's certainly one of the options maybe that needs to be implemented, but maybe there are other considerations that are more important. Well, utilitarianism says, well, if you want to know that, you must then look at the results of doing any of those actions and see which one maximizes the well-being. Okay? Okay. Next, moral flexibility. So this gives us, some explanation, and utilitarianism helps give us an explanation for why and when moral rules need to be broken sometimes. And so we have things, prohibitions against lying and stealing, and sometimes it's right to break those rules. And so utilitarianism tells us, well, what does it do? How do we know? Well, if the action raises overall well-being, then that's what you should do. If that involves breaking a moral prohibition, then so be it. Okay. And so utilitarianism is really helpful for helping us find that line to draw, between when to follow a moral rule and when an exception is called for. Okay. The moral community. This is a really fascinating part of utilitarianism, one of the most interesting philosophically, especially in recent literature. You have then the scope of the moral community consists not just of human beings, but of really any being that is capable of suffering. And this principle came from Jeremy Bentham. If you want to test as to whether someone belongs in the moral community, you ask, can they suffer? If the answer is yes, then they're a member of the moral community. And their moral worth and their moral status cannot be ignored. It has to be accounted for, in whatever decision you are going to make. So that can include then not obviously all humans, but also non-humans. So it includes many animals, for example. So what does it not include? Well, it doesn't include things like a mouse, one of these kinds of mice, because that's an inanimate object. It does not suffer. They are animals, however, can suffer, or many animals can, and so they're important then in their own right, and it doesn't really matter whether we care about them or not. It matters whether they suffer or not, or are capable of suffering. Okay, so that is gets us to an argument. I think this is the only formal argument you have in your chapter here, and this is the argument for marginal cases. And the marginal cases is a rather unfortunate term, marginal, because it's referring to human beings. And what that means is a human being who has a mental life that is restricted either by some sort of brain injury, or maybe some severe mental retardation, other kinds of reasons that are causes for developmental limitations, but nevertheless still obviously human. And so what this argument does is it puts forward this first premise. If it's more immoral to kill and eat marginal human beings and painfully experiment on them, then it's immoral to treat non-human animals this way. Okay, so this is going to be the controversial premise here. The second premise is less controversial. It's almost always immoral to kill and eat marginal human beings and to painfully experiment on them. Okay, so that is very plausible. We would not look at the mental life, a deficient mental life, as somehow a justification to then conduct painful experiments on people, on human beings, or eat them for that matter. And so, if that's the case, then according to this argument, you put the first two premises together, then the conclusion is it's almost always immoral to kill and eat animals and to painfully experiment on them. Okay, so you see how that would work to both push us toward vegetarianism as the proper action or a proper way of life that would raise overall welfare. Here again, we're talking about the moral community, including animals. And so also animal experimentation would be almost always prohibited. And I have to say almost there because you have to look at what are you can't rule it out entirely, but you have to look at what are the overall benefits and misery that would result from conducting a specific experimentation on some animals. It might be that a treatment, it might be that it could result in a very important treatment that would have enormously beneficial medical benefits, for example, and to many. And so that might be a justification for animal experimentation. But that would have to be, the farm and lab animals have to be regarded on this argument as moral equals on basis of being members of the moral community because they're capable of suffering. And so they're are moral equals, and anything that's wrong to do to a marginal human being or any human being would be wrong to do to them because they're members of the moral community as well. Okay, so the place that, or the claim here that can be contested most easily, most plausibly, is the first claim. And there are several ways you can do that. Your text goes into those. I'm not going to go into them now. I just want you to make sure that you do know this argument. Okay, and that concludes then Chapter 9, the nature and attractions of consequentialism. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next time.